last time.
Schlafly,
See,
right.
I can make up for my mistakes last. Remember when you were beating on me at the beginning of our last conversation?
Don't tell the people at home that.
I took some notes.
I never beat it on you.
When you were telling me I was working in a basement, it was brutal. So I get it. You know, you had Kate take a couple of shots.
Exactly. No, it was it's a running gag in the series that no one can say her name, which is actually, you know, when I went through the oodles, the reams of interviews that she gave, I think maybe out of 150 interviews, there were 2 people who said her name correctly. But Schlafly, there's quite a few interesting names. There's Bella Abzug.
Yes.
And you know, Jill Ruckelshaus, who was a Republican feminist. You know, like there's quite a few big names, and Schlafly is one of them. But how much control did I have?
Yeah. I mean, you were a producer, right?
Strange question to launch in with.
What do you mean launch in? We've been talking 25 minutes.
Oh, have we? Have you been recording this?
No. No.
Listen to this shit.
Yeah, but Kate, why is that a weird question? I mean, you've answered every other question about this show. There's literally a book of interviews you've done about Mrs. America. I'm just trying to come at it from.
Did I have enough control? No, I didn't. No. How much control? Well, I came in early. Darby Waller, who's the creator of the show, and Stacey Sher approached me because John Landgraf, who's fantastic at FX, had been very passionate about making the series. So I got in at the ground floor and was interested because it was about obviously second wave feminism and the drive to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, but it wasn't from the usual suspect perspective.
Right.
And I knew precious little about Phyllis Schlafly, or even how to say her name. And so it was quite an extraordinary journey for me. But I wanted to be part of a series where, you know, it wasn't a biopic about any particular character. God knows I've made enough of them. It was really about how to reverse engineer how we've got here. You know,
no, I get that. Yeah. I find myself being, you know, sort of immersed in politics and somewhat of a liberal myself, that I can't, even though you played her with sensitivity, I can't stand that fucking woman. And it's very hard for me to watch it.
But how do you feel, Marc? But I mean, how much were you aware of her?
I was kind of aware. I didn't know the whole story, but I knew enough. Like, I was okay in my life with the amount I knew about Phyllis Schlafly. But
were you aware of her, the reach of her mailing list and how she gave it to Reagan? And I mean,
no, I didn't know that stuff. I didn't know the sort of like the building of that infrastructure of conservative propaganda. No, I did not know.
Yeah,
that.
the whole language that's become the central planks of the Republican Party as we know it now, and certainly as it evolved in the 80s, were really so many of those songs that they were singing from were from her hymn book. And you know, you can say that's a dubious achievement, but it is interesting that she didn't get a lot of public credit.
So you're happy that Phyllis Schlafly is finally getting the credit she deserves on both sides of the aisle.
But she's so polarizing.
Yeah.
And you know, even from the grave, she's polarizing, and we live in such polarized times, and so much of that the inequality that we're struggling with now came out of the 70s.
Yeah,
you know, and it wasn't just, you know, inequality between the sexes. It's between the you know, the enormous wealth divide, the haves and have-nots, and the people who were so-called natural-born Americans and immigrants. You know, there's such a trench between people at the moment, and you think would think about second wave feminism in the 70s, and it's all, you know, it's an awakening, when in fact by the mid 70s to late 70s it was starting to be a shutting down. And I think a lot of that came out of the civil rights movement, and people hadn't really processed that, what there is to process about making all Americans equal. I don't know. I mean, surely that should have been a no-brainer, but it's, you know, the fact it's not in the Constitution.
It's crazy.
That was such a shock to me.
Well, it's a racist, sexist, capitalistic world here. And it's weird that what I found interesting about watching the Mrs. America is that, the lines that were drawn around this whole commie hippie thing were really to protect, the structure of capitalism more than anything else. And it seems that, some of that is filtering into, Phyllis Schlafly and her movement was to maintain the current paradigm, to not, but it was not essentially the same as protecting capitalism as much as it was protecting patriarchy. So I don't.
Well, sure, that too. But I mean, there were a lot of big businesses, including the insurance lobbies, that stood to lose a lot of money by making women profoundly equal to men.
Right.
Because the rate of insurance that women had was entirely different, and there's a whole group of people who truly believe that Phyllis Schlafly was supported by the insurance lobby. So, it's a period well worth investigating. And of course, Mrs. America is never going to answer all of those questions. It raises more questions, and hopefully people will go and.
Well, that's interesting. Did you poke around in that rabbit hole of thought around her being financed by the insurance lobby?
Yeah, I mean, the series doesn't. There's a couple of lines about it, but the series doesn't deal with it directly. There's too many. I think that we probably would have gone deeper into that that idea if it had been just about Phyllis. But because there's so many stories to tell, I mean, the journey of Shirley Chisholm, for one, and her running for president, and Jill Ruckelshaus, as I said, that was a Republican feminist. That to me was such a revelation. In a way, producerially, I wanted to be part of getting the series going, but I wanted to also scaffold all those other stories being told.
Well, it's also interesting just watching one of the episodes where you had to deal with the racism of your sort of Southern contingent, and how you kind of diplomatically threw your friend under the bus for the greater good in that moment, and were able to somehow transcend, as the character Phyllis Schlafly, the idea of racism, given that your particular agenda was being served, which is certainly relevant now.
Well, I mean, I think what you see in that moment is that's politics.
Yes.
And there was an interview that Phyllis gave with Larry King in the 80s, and she was saying, it's a bit like being a surgeon. If you can't stand the sight of blood, you need to get out of the game. You're in the wrong game. And that, if you can't stand criticism or people reviling you, then you've got no place in politics. She was really, I think, a natural political animal.
Sure.
And, there's so much about, someone said to me ages ago that the crisis, this is back in the global financial crisis, that it actually, of course there was an economic crisis, but the biggest problem facing America was that it had a crisis of governance. And I think that in a way that's, the series doesn't deal with it directly, but partially it does, because it's the drive to keep the Constitution a responsive, living document. And that somewhere along the line, the Constitution has become a biblical document that cannot and shall not be changed. And that everyone reads the Constitution in a literal way. And that the inequalities we're facing now, one has to think, well, if you did put it into the Constitution back in the 70s, when the notion of equality was seen as being a no-brainer, it wasn't a party political issue. It was just something that had to happen as part of, American evolution. That you wonder, would we be in a different place right now if the Constitution had responded to what was a kind of a universal drive for equality, and not literal equality to say men are the same as women, but that you're equal.
Representational equality.
Well, yeah, the language is powerful, don't you think?
Sure. Yeah, it should be sort of an evolving document, but now we have a president that could give two shits about the Constitution, and
Come on, three shits.
And we
give three shits.
We have a complete. We're over here living in a failed state currently, not knowing whether or not we're going to tip into full-on authoritarianism come November. So the constitutional talk is, it's almost romantic at this point.
I know, but you know what? None of us have just arrived here.
No, I know. Yeah,
that's what is so interesting for me.
Phyllis Schlafly helped us get here.
Yeah, that it's been happening for quite a while. The erosion, California just doesn't drop off into into the sea.
No.
It's a gradual process of erosion.
Sure.
And I mean, there's so many wonderful things. I don't mean that in terms of California's got specific problems. I think they're part of the solution, actually. But it's, I think it's important to kind of work out that it's the current administration has been allowed to exist. And I don't know. I think it's really important to vote in a democracy.
Yeah, I for sure. Are you aware when you're playing a villain generally?
Generally? Is it a leading question?
I know.
Well, look, I don't want to tell an audience what to think.
Uh-huh.
And particularly in this, it's, I was interested in reaching a broad audience, which is why the series, part of the reason I was excited that the series began at the point that it did. It didn't begin with, the people that so many people revere. It began with someone who was considered by many a villain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very easy to say that person's evil, that person's bad, when you don't agree with what they've done and what they've said, as I don't. But I wanted to understand how someone could think like that. And so hopefully, the series has enabled people to ask those questions.
Right. Right. There is a type of ideological thought that people believe, and they cannot see them in the way that you see them, which is wrong. And I think that's true. I think that belief is a very powerful and strange thing. And it seems like when we were talking before that she was rooted primarily in the intellectual and active pursuit of the arms race. I mean, that was
defense,
the ground zero of who she was intellectually and as a political motivator was like, we've got to not get blown up by Russia.
Yes. And so it was literally feeling that women were going to be put in the trenches with men, not at all acknowledging that the world had changed post-Vietnam, and that there shouldn't be another draft.
But there was bubbles then too, I guess. It didn't require a sort of media bubble, but there was definitely bubbles of thought that they were all living in. And it seemed like that with Vietnam, that was the first time that it was really, a line was drawn between, what sacrifice was and what was a right war or a good war. And there were people in Schlafly's circle who were just sort of like, well, these hippies are whiny babies and we shouldn't have lost that war.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. It's the whole thing about that you've got to look after yourself. If you're asking the government to help you, then there's something wrong with you. And it's that kind of line in American in the American kind of identity. It's about being exceptional. Yes. And that we all have the ability and the right to be exceptional.
That's right.
And if you're not cutting it, it's your problem.
Yeah, but now what is cutting it? Now there's so many exceptionally awful people that have such disdain for people who are truly exceptional that the whole bar is being moved into like, I don't even know what exceptional looks like to these fucking people.
I know it's really. I mean, I come from Australia, and so anyone who's an artist. Or an actor or a writer, or you can't even call yourself an artist. Right. It's a dirty word, a pretentious, dirty word. But that you're considered to be an elitist. Yeah. And you think, well, hang on, what about these people who own sort of 95% of the wealth in Australia? Wouldn't they be called the elite? And do any of them work in the arts? And that somehow public intellectuals have become, the notion of thought or deep thought or trying to think longer than tomorrow is somehow seen as being elite. When did having an education become an elite act?
Here's the weird thing about this country is by calling, you're a comedian, don't talk politics. Leave that to who exactly? We're people. Who the fuck talks politics? Our president doesn't know how to talk politics. Who's supposed to talk politics? But the weird thing is that they blame us for being some sort of con people, like we're getting away with something. And our president is the biggest grifter that ever lived, but there's this cognitive dissonance between, where they're being driven to put their anger and what reality is. And it's a real trick, and Phyllis Schlafly helped create those tricks. That's all. And I think
There you go. That's it.
Yeah.
You said it.
Now, okay, let's go back to this thing you said, because when I brought up the villain thing,